In the last video, we talked about one way to overcome the prisoner's dilemma is if I care about your payoffs and or you care about my payoffs, and so we have altruistic preferences, then we can get to the social optimum as opposed to the Nash equilibrium. Other social preferences that can help us get to a better outcome are inequality aversion. So disliking outcomes in which individuals, might get a lot more than others, and we'll talk about that. Reciprocity. So, if you help me, I'll help you. Social norms. So social norms are basically just sort of the unwritten rules of society, right? Sort of common understandings of how to act in situations. And so if social norm is, well, if I do something selfish that hurts you, that's against the social norm, then we can avoid those outcomes. On the other hand, if the social norm is, I only have to look after myself, I don't have to worry about anybody else, then we're more likely to get into that non-optimal outcome. And so we're going to talk about in the next couple of videos two different games. One is the public goods game and one is the ultimatum game. And so in the public goods game, there are usually a handful of players, often four. Um, and the idea is how much to contribute to a public good. And one of the things that we'll look at is that in the public goods game, you can often get an outcome that changes from a one-shot game to a repeated game. So if you just play it once, people are more likely to contribute and get closer to the social optimum as opposed to the Nash equilibrium. But as they repeat the game, they see that they're being punished basically for being generous, and so we move towards the Nash equilibrium over time. But that can change depending on how the game is set up, right? So depending on whether there is different social norms, depending on whether there's some way to reciprocate payments, or whether there's some way to punish people who are being selfish. And so if behaving selfishly has consequences, it may no longer be the dominant strategy. So the public goods game basically is just a game where you have four people, you give them each a pot of money, and you say, okay, you can contribute a certain amount of your money into the common pot. And that common pot is then multiplied by some factor and then distributed equally. And so the idea is that it's meant to represent, for instance, paying taxes to fix roads or build the electrical grid or anything that is used by everybody, right? Any type of infrastructure that is used by everybody. In the example here, it's an irrigation project. So if we all pay into this irrigation project, then we can all benefit from it and we will all do better. The problem is that the dominant strategy is to free ride. The dominant strategy is to hope that everybody else contributes, but not to contribute yourself. So for example, they're looking, this is one example where Kim is the player that we're interested in, and you can see that if she contributes and nobody else does, she gets -2, and if she doesn't contribute and nobody else does, she gets 0. If she contributes and one other person contributes, she has 6, and if she doesn't contribute, then she gets 8. And basically what this says is that she always does worse if she doesn't contribute, right? And so not contributing, the red payoffs, is dominant to contributing. And yet we see that the more people who contribute, the better off everybody is. So if we can get everybody to contribute, then we're all better off. But every individual has an incentive to not contribute, right? And that's very common. And it's why we have, things like the IRS that make you pay your taxes, because even though you benefit from public education, police and fire departments, national defense, you'd be better off just not paying yourself, right? And everybody's in that situation. So we need some mechanism to make people pay. But in this game, what we see is that, first of all, the sort of contribution varies by place, right? And so, people in Denmark are much more likely to contribute than, say, people in Greece. And that's sort of based on social norms. But what we see is that in a repeated game, even though they all start out contributing a fair amount, they all contribute less and less as the game goes on. And that's because they see that being generous actually reduces their payoff. And so by the 10th period, we're contributing a lot less than we were in the first period, right? And so that can be a problem as people learn that being generous does not actually benefit them, and so they start contributing less and less. But if we introduce a mechanism that allows free riders to be identified and for the other players to punish those free riders, so if we can say, okay, here's round one, we all contributed 10, you didn't contribute anything. And so in period two, we have some mechanism that says that you're going to get even a lower payoff than you would otherwise. Then you say, oh, okay, well, then I guess I better contribute. And so what we see here is that that tends to keep the contribution more or less where it starts, right? And so we still have differences, right? We still have some places that are more willing to contribute than others, but we don't see that trend over time that really reduces those contributions. So repeated games can both lead us to be more or less generous depending on how those repeated games are set up. And so if punishment and reciprocity is sort of built into the game, then people will tend to be more generous, or at least equally generous over time. Whereas if those aren't set up into the game, then people will tend to be less generous over time.